back to my channel. Yes, I know, long anticipated. You had to wait an entire month for this. Definitely had nothing to do with the fact that I was kind of hoping that, you know, lockdown I'd get a chance to go back to London, where all my books are, and have the satisfaction of holding up a big old stack of books for you. That's not happened. What has happened? I didn't get to go back to London. I'm still here. I love being 20-something. Still being at my parents' house. I know many of you feel me, but I think for ego's sake, I just really wanted that big old stack of books because I read 20 things in 2020. For many of you, you'll go like, oh, that's not very many. For my dyslexics out there, you'll be like, fuck yeah, that's impressive. I think it's the most I've ever read on Goodreads. Technically, I finished Brideshead in 2020, but I counted it last year as having read it in 2019 because I read most of it in 2019. So yeah, my Goodreads will say 21 things, but I read 20. I read 4,277 pages. But now in an effort to make sure this video isn't a million years long, I'm not gonna spend too long talking about each individual book. When I have spoken about it, and I know for a fact that I've spoken about it at length, I will let you know in the description where that video is if you want to know more. Sometimes it's like, there'll be a digression about a book 30 minutes into a 50-minute long vlog. I can forgive those of you who come to me for book content for maybe not having found that, but a lot of it's in my vlogs, especially before I started doing these as separate like videos in their own right. So if you ever need a fix, go have a look for some of my vlogs because it is there. So the first thing that I read in its entirety in 2020 was A Good School by Yates. I haven't spoken about this anywhere. I adored this. I absolutely adored this. If you are looking for things in the vein of dark academia, I would absolutely recommend this. I haven't seen it on many of those lists, but this is very much like New England boarding school, like a boys' boarding school, very like, you know, exclusive, whatever. And I guess for me, one of the reasons that I read it is having boarded. I just like reading that, just like see how it adds up, being like, oh, is this like how I experienced it? And maybe it's a little bit for me, obviously trying to recapture that teenage nostalgia. Because I sometimes think a lot of boarding school things are very like sensationalized, but in really bizarre ways, but it kind of misses out. It like focuses on like the elitism and the exclusivity, but it doesn't really highlight the bits that are actually really fun about it. Like you live with your friends, which is like, it's just so fun, and you get far too much free reign, to be honest. I was more unsupervised at school than I was when I was at home. But yeah, just something about like finding that back, and I think Yates really did that. This was the first time that I read American literature and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I've tried with Fitzgerald, I've tried with, oh god, Henry James. I still cannot believe you all told me to read The American over reading Brideshead. How dare you? You were all wrong about that. I put a lot of book things on Instagram before they come here, so again, if you want your fix, I even have a highlight of it. It really recaptured that nostalgia. But then there are some really tragic parts of the book as well. You get sort of tangled up in the protagonist's life, I can't remember what he's called, but like the figures around him as well, like his friends and his teachers. This is set in between the world wars again. I say again because so is Brideshead. And it's really sort of, again, painful in that way, especially because when they're young boys turning into men. Yeah, there's something painful about reading that. Just because you know how it ends, right? But I just thought it was excellent. It wasn't very long, it was very easy to read. And as a first more satisfactory foray into American literature, very delighted by it, to be honest. And I think it just highlighted to me that I'm reading the wrong time period in American literature. If you have any more recommendations from around this time, the 60s, 70s this was written in, I really liked this. Then next I read Camus' Create Dangerously. They're the, oh, I have an example. They're the Tiny Penguin modern like essays, and I rate those incredibly highly. It's like sort of a taste test of lots of different authors in terms of like their essays. So you learn a lot about their style, about their voice, about their values in a way, like what they want to talk about. And you even get a lot of people who aren't necessarily novelists per se, but people who are like philosophers and just people who are great thinkers, and whether that extends into their literature or into their art or into their like politics. I like them. Their little taste tests being like, oh, who do I like? Do I want to read more of this? Do I want to experience that? Do I want to have a look at this? So I read Camus. Camus is convoluted. Camus is miserable. The existentialists all are. Maybe that would float some of your boats. I have flirted with the idea of reading The Plague because I have a sense of humour. Actually, my camera is currently sat on on my part of my TBR is Defoe's Journal of a Plague Year. I thought Camus is convoluted. I thought that he's miserable, and I know that he has kind of like, for so many people who adore him, but I'm just like, I cannot read any more of this or I will throw myself out of a window. I find it hideously depressing, and it's just not a worldview that I subscribe to. I'm not an existentialist. That is not how I like to see the world. Even though this was about 60 pages long, it took me forever to read. It's dense, and there are a collection of speeches that have been transcribed, but oh boy, no, not for me. Next then, I read someone who is for me, someone who you know all is for me. I read Beckett. Beckett's The End. I read both of these during lockdown. My god, I love Samuel Beckett. I love an absurdist worldview. If I have to think about a piece of literature or whatever that has shaped me so like deeply, it's Godot. Waiting for Godot has very much shaped a massive foundation of who I am as a person. In summary, don't wait for the next step, don't wait for that next thing to come or for some kind of deus ex machina thing to happen to you. Go out and live your life and enjoy yourself anyway, because otherwise you're gonna wait around for something or someone who may or may not come, and it's just not worth it. Also, don't look to every next hoop to jump through. Enjoy the journey as well. It's about the journey, not the destination. There we go, I've distilled Beckett into Pinterest quotes. That's the essence of why I love Beckett, which is why I really enjoyed The End. This is 2 short stories, you know, about vagrants and about how they drift, and not the pointlessness of life, but more the way that you enjoy that when you don't belong to that rigid conformist societal structure anymore, and you have that freedom to just be. It's still depressing, absolutely, but not in the same way that Camus is. It was more of a choice element in it. But then at the same time, it's funny because it is so tragic. And I find a lot of comfort in a lot of what Beckett writes, an awful lot. And I spoke about both of these in my first lockdown vlog that I did. Then I read American Marriage by Tayari Jones. This is one of the more recent things I started to read. It's kind of like sparked the rest of the choices that I've made. It's about this couple who then suddenly sort of torn apart because her husband is incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit, that she knows he didn't commit. And then sort of their relationship in terms of how they respond to each other throughout the years that he is in prison, and then the moment he's out, and how, you know, when you love someone, do you wait for them? Do you love them enough to let them go and move on with their lives? He's imprisoned for something he didn't do. How that is very much like matter of fact of like, how they take it very much as a matter of fact of their like Black American experience. The statistic is something horrendous. It's like 1 in 3 Black men will be incarcerated at some point in their life in the US. That should horrify you, it horrifies me. But the book is like, I don't know how to phrase it, it's like tenderly written. It wasn't like the best thing I've ever read, but it certainly is like an insight into modern America. If you don't have access to that viewpoint, this is an interesting way in. I liked it. I wouldn't be like, it's the best thing I've ever read, but it was nice. Like, I don't think it was a waste of my time. Then I read another one of the Penguin Modern Classics, and it was Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp. You know, I love the Met Gala. I really love fashion. For a long time I wanted to be a fashion journalist. I love clothes as expression, as artistic expression, as gender expression, as whatever. I just think it's such an amazing way to tell the world who you are. So like the Met always like really floats my boat. Well, I went to New York with my mum a couple of years ago, and we went to the Heavenly Bodies exhibition. Oh God, it was so good. We had a whale of a time. Was this the last Met Gala that we had? Will there be one this year? Probably not, no. I decided I would read said Notes on Camp. And it is really an entertaining read, and it's very interesting, like just a way of like seeing the world. And I love Sontag. I've read a bunch of her other things now. Regarding the Pain of Others, in light of photography, is really, really interesting. And as someone who is a filmmaker, again, like the way that you capture someone's pain and suffering is so interesting in terms of like the morals and ethics behind that. So in Notes on Camp, it's just great. It's like a deconstructed way of seeing the world, but especially seeing like clothes. And I'm very much of the opinion that, you know, camp is very much like, it's a sensibility. It's more about how you act, and it's about how you are rather than necessarily who you are or what you are. You can wear something glittery and feathery and an offensive colour, doesn't necessarily make it camp. If you have the attitude to go with it, then you can make anything camp. So because if you watch those Met Gala like interviews where these, you know, these celebrities are all asked like, oh, who are you wearing, la la, what's camp to you? They come up with these like, you're just like, wow, you didn't, it's so short, it's like this long. You didn't do the reading? There was like one thing you had to read. You didn't? No, you didn't? Alright, fine. It's so fun to read, and I just thought as like context for a cultural moment, I thought for me it just made so much sense to read, and I really enjoyed it. Then I read Nancy Mitford's Fredrick the Great. I read this during my readathon. I read the last 3 things during my readathon. It was the last one in her sort of selection of historical biographies. She's got one on Voltaire, she's got one on the Sun King, she has one on Madame de Pompadour, so I had to obviously complete the set. Obviously. I remember very little of it. Reading anything historical is not for me. I have the memory of a sieve when it comes to things like this. But she tells these histories in a very accessible, entertaining way. You should take what she says with a grain of salt, but almost in that way you understand that she's taking liberties, and that's more above board than maybe with other historians you read. Because if you read, Ophelia made a fantastic video on what a historian does, I'm going to link it down below. But whenever a historian is like, you know, telling you any history, their own biases are at play. That's just a fact. Mitford is very obvious about this. Sometimes these things can be entertaining. I don't want laborious, boring military histories because I just don't care. I do want to know more things about the gossip. So, and I think with Fredrick Great, that's fun. And like she gives them like more of a character and a personality, which again, liberties, but also very enjoyable. I really rate Mitford. I think she's just a wonderfully entertaining, often light-hearted person to read. Less entertaining and light-hearted. I finally finished reading Sade. I read Justine in 2 sittings, about a year apart. I remember I raced through the first half and then was like, I have to put this down now. And then raced through the other half of it during lockdown 1. I have talked about Sade before, I've talked about Sade at length. I wrote my dissertation on Sade. You are going to get a very, very special book video soon because I've done a thing that I'm thrilled about. Only me. But Sade is not for everyone. Sade is where you get the word sadism from. The S in BDSM. I find Sade fascinating. Ooh, I found a copy of Simone de Beauvoir wrote an essay, Must We Burn Sade. I found an English translation online for free. I'll see if I can link it for you, but I'm... I love Sade, I find Sade fascinating. I find anything to do with like power exchanges so interesting, and that's pretty much all of it. Like even all the gross, torturous sex stuff, it's all rooted in power dynamics. And I think libertinism is just so fascinating to look at. Something like Dangerous Liaisons is a libertine novel. It's also an excellent novel. It's pages upon pages of philosophical digression. Then it's like weird sex stuff. Pages of philosophical digression, messed up sex stuff. It's basically like the idea that like the sex is an enactment of the philosophy in a way that you test the boundaries and limits of what you can and cannot do as a person, especially if you like try and take it away from any moral and social, political, legal constructs and frameworks. It's like how these things exist in encapsulated environments. Because Justine basically goes on this enormous odyssey. This girl can't catch a break. There's always some messed up count living in his own little castle and has decided, chateau, and has decided that he is very much Lord and Saviour now and will dictate whatever he wants and all that goes. It's just fascinating. I really enjoy Justine as a character because she always terrible stuff happens to her. But she just keeps going and she just keeps arguing with everybody. She argues with all of these libertines and like, you know, these like powerful, educated men, and she's just still there like, fuck you. Honestly, as a character, fascinating. Yeah, and all the sex stuff just is interesting. It's a lot to like, sometimes you're reading it like, ooh, ooh. And sometimes you're reading it like, As far as hills that I will die on, Sade is absolutely one of them. I will always defend Sade and why it's fascinating to read him. Do I agree with everything he does? Fuck no, it's messed up as shit. Sade is a person, messed up as shit. All of his stuff is written messed up as fuck. But that's why it's interesting to like read and stuff, because Sade represents the utmost of extremes. Fascinating. Incredibly interesting to look at in terms of power exchange and dynamics, and especially with authority. Then I read Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun. This was so good. I can't over exaggerate how good this book was. I really, really, really highly rate it. I am so happy that I read it. It's definitely more out of my, not comfort zone, but definitely more out of my like horizon. So it was just something else, but I was like this, because it was recommended to me. I was just like, this was good. This was really good. So this is set in Nigeria in the 1960s during their civil war. I think it's her only historical novel. I've read some of her feminist non-fiction before, and I just thought that was excellent. To read this, I was like, okay, this is very, very long and this terrifies me. But in the end, you just don't put it down. The way she creates these characters, but you become so attached to them, and the like empathy that she like creates for you to have for them. And like, I think it's such a good way of seeing war, because I think very often we've been given these very masculine war narrative about fighting, whatever, and about glory and about for your nation and all of that. But when you take things from a feminine perspective, it's so much more about the people this is actually affecting and the way this actually changes, upends everyone else's lives. Because, you know, the people who are out fighting, it's a very, very small minority. You know, the people who become displaced, the people who die, the people who, you know, experience famine, the people who experience, you know, their children dying because they can't find food to feed them. Like, the levels of desperation that you get driven to a point where you're stripped of your entire humanity. The way that she tells that is, it's very slow and it's heart-wrenching, because her characters come from such, like, her main characters are from this very privileged background, and then to see them sort of realise that they lose all of these things, there's a lot further down for them to go. And there's like moments where these characters are like watching other people scramble for food and fight for it, and they're like, oh, I would never do that. And then like a couple chapters later, that's exactly where they're at. So just seeing how it, you know, strips you of these certain things and ways that you identify who you are, and takes away so much of everything that you love, and it's just awful. And I think she does it so well. So I really, really encourage you to read this. I cried quite a bit when I finished reading it. Oh shit, there's so much more to go through. Then I read some of Mitford's fiction. She's got quite a lot of fiction, so I was like, I spoke about all of these books I'm going to talk about now in my lockdown book read video. I really enjoyed Nancy Mitford. I enjoy her writing so much. It's just sort of like a really nice, warm hug. Elitist, classist hug, if I have to be frank. Well, I don't know, knowing that, you kind of indulgent, I guess, to read now with a modern perspective. And again, it's this very like country house, old English way of seeing things. It's not about the narrator, it's about her cousin and how she sees her fall irresponsibly in and out of love, and how watching her marry for the wrong reasons, and, you know, fall in love with the wrong people, and how like all of that, watching her go through these many lovers and how none of them actually satisfy her in the end. And it's terrifying, obviously, because I'm like, oh shit, I'd rather this didn't happen to me. But then it's why I like the trepidations and like the warnings for certain reasons that people get married. Again, marriage is something I just find fascinating to look at historically. I genuinely believe that if you have a better understanding of historically why people have married and how that has changed coming to the 21st century, that I think you'll probably marry for better reasons, or not at all, if you realise that it's something that is archaic, outdated, and just not necessary in the way that it may once have been. Again, Mitford, excellent. I really love her. Ooh, the next I read, Audre Lorde, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. This was on so many Black Lives Matter reading lists. Really, really good. I bought a bunch of her poetry because I was like, I love the way that you write and I just want more of it. So I read a couple of her poems, and she's just one of these like wildly intelligent women that you just read and you're like, wow. So yeah, again, this was a lot about race, and especially her experience in being a black woman, and then like how, well, unsurprisingly, the thing that stuck with me the most was the idea that she said she would often have conversations with like white women, for example, and then white women would do the whole thing like, I'm so sorry, whatever. But when you do stuff like that, you recenter conversations on whiteness rather than actually listening to her and letting her speak. Then all you do is talk about how bad and how guilty you feel without actually listening to someone who needs you to just shut up and pass the mic. It's just so well written, like it's just really good. And this is why I'm annoyed that I don't have any of my books, because I can't read any of my notes in the beginning of my book to tell you more cohesive things. But I spoke about it in a vlog. But she's just wonderful, and like, if you wanted something short, just excellent. Then I read Norwegian Wood by Murakami. May have started an obsession, and I have 5 of his books. 3 of them I have already read. Norwegian Wood was just fantastic. Murakami, you know, it's 1960s Japan, which I don't know anything about. So he builds up this world around you. It's very visceral, it's very sensorial. It's very much about sex, death and suicide. I don't want to say that it's about love. I feel like it's wrong to say that it's about love. But like infatuation and maybe not even romantic love, but like different ways that you love someone, ways that you learn to let people go. And it's a painful novel. It's painful to read. It's so good, but it really hurts. And especially if any of you are students at the moment, I highly recommend that you read it now. I'm doing my postgrad now, but like it just sort of sucked me back a little bit into my undergrad, and I'm just like, oh fuck. Feeling of like being in a big city and you're on your own and you're like, whoa, help. Because I'm not very much into magical realism, that I think this was again a good way into reading Murakami. If you're a student now at the moment, I highly recommend it. Then I read Murakami. What I talk about when I talk about running. If you didn't know, I run. I love running. It can easily become an obsessive thing, or you're just like, wow, this is just a massive part of my personality and I don't want to shut up about it. So it's just nice to read someone else who has those like feelings of like just intensity and joy towards a thing that you also have intensity and joy towards. It's just fun, really enjoyable. And I don't have much more to say apart from if you run, you'll enjoy it. And I also read that straight after reading Norwegian Wood because I just wasn't ready to like let go of that world. Then I read Circe. And I am so attached to this book now. I'm so attached to it. I just loved it, and I loved it for really different reasons than Song of Achilles. I've made an entire book video about both of those. If you like the Greeks, read it. If you've like anything about witches, read it. Just, it's so like comforting in that way that you're reading about something that, to an extent, like I know the Odyssey, I know what happened in the Odyssey, I know it quite well. So just to read that from different perspectives is glorious, and I really rate it. It's not the best thing I've ever read, but it certainly is one of the most enjoyable, especially with that sort of slant on classics. I think you just can't go wrong. I'll argue it's dark academia, you can fight me on it, but I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I love a good feminist retelling. I saw someone on Goodreads like said they were going to read the Penelopiad, which is by Margaret Atwood, so I'm like, ooh, I'm gonna read the Penelopiad. And the thing is, it's classics. Classics is fair game for stuff like this. Kind of like fan fiction the entire time, if you think about it. Really enjoyed it. Then I read Walter Murch's In the Blink of an Eye. This I read because I make movies and I edit, and I have spent many hours of my life editing the hundreds of videos that I have, and several films as well. It was just really interesting to read, almost in like a formalised discussion, something that I do in a large part reflexively. Most of my ability to edit is baked into my muscle memory, and I just do it without thinking about it. So to read something about it was like, ooh, this person does all the things that I do too, that I don't think about. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. Walter Murch edited like The English Patient, he cut Apocalypse Now. Top tier. It was very good. And again, one of the things I also find really interesting is how many like incredibly accomplished editors there are that are women. And some of the like earliest like female Oscar win for women that were not like best actress are actually in editing. So I'm just like, what is this about? And we know Thelma Schoolmaker like just is bae. And then obviously I went in and I read Song of Achilles. Again, I made an entire video on this and Circe, but this broke my heart. And I cried and cried so much. Circe is the Odyssey and this is the Iliad. I've told you so many times, read the Odyssey and the Iliad. They're really fun, they're really fun stories. And to an extent you probably know the story anyway. The bit with the horse doesn't happen in the Iliad, it happened in the Aeneid. I know, I was really disappointed by this too. I was reading it like, where's the bit with the horsey? And there was no bit with the horsey. Song of Achilles. Pain. pain. If you want more coherent commentary on it, watch that, but fuck, this hurt. Next, I read Andy Warhol's Fame. Again, another one of these. This is a quick read. This is just like, it was very much his like digressions on love and fame. I just thought that it was interesting. And then I found myself agreeing with a lot of the things he had to say about love. And I was like, wow. Google's BuzzFeed, am I emotionally unavailable quiz? Because I identified way too much of what he was saying. That threw me into a tiny crisis. But I guess it's just always interesting to have different perspectives on, you know, love and relationships. I think one of the interesting things you learn as you grow up and like you date more people and whatever is that there is no one way of loving. There is no one way of being loved. The way that you love will not be the same way that someone else does. And I think it's very much in part about finding somebody who loves you in a way that you want to be loved. Date lots of people, fall in love with lots of people, make a lot of horrendous mistakes and get your heart broken a bunch of times. It's wonderful for personal growth and for figuring out who you are, especially in ways that like relate to other people. But I really enjoyed what Warhol had to say about love, like about all that. Again, I can't think of anything more to say on it because I don't have any of my notes. I know I enjoyed it and I would encourage you to read it. It's very like bite-sized. Oh Lord, then I read The Course of Love. I'm still conflicted on this because I don't like the way that Alain de Botton talks about love. I appreciate the way that he talks about long-term committed relationships, how we work on them and how really we should all go to therapy. And like, I love that kind of discussion. I don't like how he talks about falling in love. That really irks me. It grinds my gears and I just despise it. I think it's definitely an interesting book to read, and I still argue that if you read something and it leaves you feeling apathetic, you wasted your time. If you read something and it pissed you off, and you read something and it frustrated you, and you read something and it elated you, like, then you've read something that is interesting. You read something that elicited a response from you, that clearly made you think, that clearly made you question the way that you experience things because you got so frustrated with how someone said that they experience things, and with that certain worldview. That's even why even though I don't necessarily like Camus, I find him interesting to read. You don't need to just read things that you enjoy. You should also read things that annoy you and that like frustrate you and that will, you know, yeah, like elicit some kind of response, because it's prompting you to be challenged. It's prompting you to rethink how you think about things. It's prompting you to try and maybe in part restructure some of your belief system because someone has showed you a different way to do it that you may or may not like more. As a book, you know, it's the story of this couple and how they fall in love and how they get married and how they have kids and how their marriage evolves and struggles and succeeds. So it's the story and then interjections of philosophical digression, like chunks, almost like a reflection on the narrative that you've just had. As a structure, it's completely unique to anything I've ever read, but it felt very stop-start. I was like you're in a jerky car. For example, with like if you're in a car with me who still struggles to go into second gear. That's right, though, kids. We twisted mum's arm when she's giving us driving lessons, so I haven't driven a vehicle, but it's still like me stalling the car every 5 minutes. Sorry, 5 meters. I think it's important to read things that you don't like and don't necessarily agree with. Just don't read something crap, but do read something that's different and challenges your thoughts and feelings. Then I read, finally I can talk about the books that I have in my hand. Then I read Achebe's Africa's Tarnished Name. I bought Achebe for his fiction. Haven't read any fiction, have read this. I think this would have been super complimentary to when I did some post-colonial modules with my undergrad. If you don't do anything like that, but you maybe want something like that, I guess read this. It wasn't the best thing I've ever read. I feel like I didn't fully get into it. The most interesting essay in this is how he explains like why Africa is viewed the way that it is, especially with the fact that it's a whole ass continent and the way that we being the West very often homogenize it and just assume that it is all the same, which is frankly outrageous. I think it's a lot to do with like the scramble for Africa, the slave trade, etc. Like it's a very short but interesting way of understanding why we have a lot of these myths about Africa as a continent. I'd recommend it if you have an interest in it, or if you, maybe specifically if you don't have a like interest in it and you want something that's accessible and short and not convoluted or highly complicated with a massive historical background to be able to understand it, then this will do you good. Then I read more Murakami because of course I did. I spoke about this at length in my Christmas vlog. I really enjoyed this. Murakami is I don't even like Murakami's a misogynist, but a lot of Murakami's characters are rather misogynist, but in the way that they really think that they are all that as characters, and the way that they treat women. So I just want to say, like, do you think about that when you read him? And I still think it's an interesting male perspective, because these men are the kind of men that would never think that they're doing anything wrong. But yeah, it's about this guy who like opens a jazz bar, really? Murakami? No way! How he sees this woman again from his childhood, and how like it makes him question all of his relationships. It's a really interesting way to look at love, and there is something more magical realist in this, because I'm like, is she a ghost? You don't know. And it's very much about like having that like crisis. It kind of is a midlife crisis. And if you're wondering if you maybe got put on a route, and if you've actually done the right thing, if you've gone the right way, if you've ended up making the right life choices, and maybe even if you had enough autonomy in the choices that you made, like definitely about sex, brackets obviously, a whole 9 to 5, feeling lost, feeling like you're floating through life, I think is always an interesting one, where you feel like you're very much like on repeat, kind of like similar to Fight Club, I guess, but that feeling like you're on a set path, you're on cruise control, and you're just floating through life doing all the things that you feel like socially you're obviously supposed to do, that you're told to do, that you're expected to do. And then feeling like you've made all of these choices, but I don't think you actually made a single one, really. It was kind of already made for you before you even thought about it. I think it's interesting in that sense, and then interesting in terms of relationships, in terms of love, potentially more lack thereof, and just as kind of insular way of seeing the world. And like that grief of not necessarily having lost a person that you know, but more that having lost a version of a person that you know. Potentially even that version, that grieving for a lost version of yourself, and even grieving for like a potential version of yourself. So grieving for the loss of a potential version of yourself that you could have been but never were. That's kind of how I see it. I enjoyed it. But you should read Murakami with a grain of salt. And then finally, the last thing that I read, another one of Chimamanda's books, because they're fucking fantastic. This is, oh, I'm gonna butcher this, Ijawele. Dear Ijawele, a feminist manifesto and 15 suggestions. So this is something she wrote for like a friend who had a baby, and it's like the 15 ways that she hopes said friend raises said child. And it was just wonderful. I think Adichie will be, and probably is, arguably one of like the 21st century feminists, like one of the third wave feminists. She's just such an intelligent woman. When you read her and you're like, this is such an obvious thing, but why didn't I think about it? And it's a lot about like how you raise girls. And then I guess also how you hope you raise your boys. There are these fascinating studies where they dress little like boys, but they dress them up as girls, and vice versa. And then they give people said child to play with. Those who are handed the little boy dressed as a girl, they will take the child to more dollies and more like babies and teddies and stuff, but they will take the boys, and they will take them more to like blocks and any abacus and any kind of like sort of building thing. So what you do is you're taking what you think is a girl, teaching them things like empathy, and teaching them things like, you know, caring and like warmth and like love and all of that kind of stuff. And then you're teaching boys more, you know, logical things. You're teaching them spatial things. You're teaching them more logical things. And then these people at the end were told that they had done this, and these grown-ups were like shocked, because they themselves were not aware they had these gender biases to this like extreme extent. And it took us a bit about that to make sure that you teach your boys, you know, kindness, this empathy and this like caring, as well as teaching your girls this like logic and reason. And it's just so interesting that like from such a small age, from literally like out of the womb, and you're like already being conditioned this way. It's mad. It's a lot about like that, and it's a lot about like making sure that what you're doing is raising a well-rounded human. This is the kind of thing that would be a good read for like anyone who is gonna like have a child soon, or just like it's an interesting way of thinking about raising a child. The power that you have over this tiny mind. Does Emma want kids? But I just think it's really, really interesting, and it was just really well written. I just think this is something that basically voiced and echoed a lot of the things that I have thought about in the past, but maybe not necessarily had them in such like a, you know, formalized context. Highly recommend. I read this in like a couple of hours. I know one of the other things that like she mentioned this is like when people say like, oh, where's your husband? Oh, he's babysitting the kids. Ma'am, that is your husband. He's not babysitting the kids. He's looking after his child. And there's just so much to talk about in terms of like division of labour and like domestic and whatever. Oh, it's never ending in terms of when you start like thinking about it. If you want to read more like feminist stuff, really recommend. It's not difficult and it's very accessible. Like that is massively a thing, is that so much of it needs to be accessible and it's practical as well. That is everything that I read in 2020. Not everything, I didn't finish a couple things, but that is everything that I finished this year. That's it. What's the best thing that you guys read? Ooh, what is the best thing that I read? What is the best thing that I read? What is the best thing that I read? I have no idea what the best thing I read is. I refuse to answer that question. Anyway, that's what I read in 2020. I'll link all of the like more extensive discussions that I've had about these books down below. I've already read 4.5 books in January. My goal is to read 25 books. Let me know what the best thing that you read all of last year was. You have a shelf on my Goodreads, so I take your recommendations very, very seriously, as you should by now know. Like, subscribe, and all that jazz. And I will see you all very, very soon.